Okay, now that you've watched the previous video and completed that little mini quiz asking you to identify broad versus specific types of information in an example introduction, we'll cover a few more logistics relating to how you should actually go about writing your introduction draft. So you might be thinking, okay, I know introductions are supposed to contain these two different types of information, broad and specific, but where do I find this information? It's almost like finding a needle in a haystack, right? You have all these different books, all these papers, all this knowledge. How do you know where to start? Well, the good news is you've already done a lot of the legwork for this. So I've been trying to intentionally build this proposal writing as different steps and different chunks that we can build on a little bit each week. And if you think back to when we first identified your knowledge gap, we talked about how a knowledge gap is built on the fact that there is previous work that's already been done. So that's what's highlighted here in red. That's essentially what's known already. And if we think about that within the context of the introduction information we've been talking about, this is our broad type info. And then what's in blue is what's still not known, which are our specific type info. And so really what you want to do when you're starting to flesh out and write the draft of your introduction is go back to that knowledge gap that you identified previously. And specifically when you're writing your introduction, you want to build on the previous work component or portion of your knowledge gap. So what I mean by that is fleshing out, giving some examples specifically of citations and providing examples of these other papers. So right now, what this says for the knowledge gap on the screen, it just says previous research has demonstrated such and such. When you're writing out your introduction, you want to provide more details about that. So, okay, previous research has shown this. What actual papers are you referring to? You can give some quick summaries of those different papers and then provide the actual citations like I showed as an example in the previous video. Now I say to specifically build on the previous work portion of your knowledge gap because really in the introduction specifically, we don't need to build on this what's not known yet, the specific info. It's really enough in the introduction just to lay out this specific info and identify that this is work that needs to be done, but we're really going to provide more details about how we're going to address that in subsequent sections of the proposal, like in the approach section, for instance. So we'll cover that in later weeks. So really when you're going back to your identified knowledge gap and you're thinking about how to start writing your introduction, you want to build on that previous work portion by summarizing some previous papers and providing citations. Okay, and how long should your introduction be? Probably not as long as you think. So I don't think I've mentioned this previously. The whole research proposal for the NSFD RFP is only 2 pages long total. So I'm showing here on the screen an example of the research proposal that I wrote as a grad student, well actually the summer before I was a grad student, to be funded as a PhD student. I was actually awarded an NSFG RFP, so that's why I incorporate this into my classes, and I really try to provide you all opportunities because it funded 3 years of my PhD in grad school. So these proposals are actually very short, and that can be, there's pros and cons. It's nice because you don't have to write as much. It's also relatively challenging because distilling all of your information down into only 2 pages can be difficult, especially for me, at least. So overall, your whole research proposal is only going to be 2 pages. That means when you're thinking about your intro specifically, it should only be about 250 words. So generally like 2 paragraphs. In this image that I'm showing here, that's laying out my entire research proposal. This section that's highlighted here is my introduction. So again, it's taking up about a third to a half of that first page and should only be about 250 words. So when you're thinking about drafting an introduction, maybe in other classes or other proposals you've written, that section needs to be longer. Here, it's really important to keep it concise because you need to leave enough room in the rest of your very short 2-page proposal to make sure you address the other components that we'll talk about later this semester. And that example that I just showed on the previous slide is available for you on Canvas. It doesn't really make sense to go step by step through a full written proposal in a video, but I am providing that to you on Canvas. It's color coded so it can help you see what different parts of the proposal I wrote to address these different required parts of a proposal. I have an image of fish eggs here because the specific proposal that I wrote as a grad student was to use molecular techniques to identify different species of fish eggs, like we talked about in the DNA barcoding video. These are actual images of, I didn't take them, but they're actual images of fish eggs taken from the Scripps Pier in La Jolla. My friend Alice is the one who did this study. Her favorite fish egg was always this one on the right. Whenever they collected it, they would call it the glitter ball. She was always excited when they got a glitter ball sample. But if you go to Canvas, you can find a full example from my NSF GRFP that shows you how I approached writing this proposal. Okay, so if we think about what we've covered so far in terms of writing your proposal, we first started by identifying a knowledge gap. And that knowledge gap isn't an explicit part of your proposal per se, but it's the very first step that's required to help you build and construct that research idea into specific aims. So we covered this last week. In this video here, this module, we covered how to write your introduction. And so really, again, we're building these different pieces block by block, right? And if we look ahead to our first proposal, so again, for our class, we're writing one full 2-page GRFP proposal at the very end of the course, but we're doing 2 quote-unquote practice or mini proposals before we turn in that final one to get some practice writing these proposals. For the first proposal you're going to write, the components that are required are listed here on this slide. So you'll need to include a title, an introduction, your research idea, 2 specific aims, and then some references that you use to help you. So at this point in the semester, really we've covered every different part, the more difficult part, so title and references. I'll provide some tips on Canvas, but I trust that overall you're pretty familiar with how to do those components. But we've covered the introduction, the research idea and aims, and so you really have all the skills that you need now to write that draft of your first proposal. So I just like to recap to make sure that you remember and remind you of all the things that you've learned so far this semester, right? Maybe when you started this semester, you didn't know how to approach writing a research proposal at all, but hopefully now you understand a little bit better the process and how to approach that. And what you'll do this week is write a draft of your introduction that your peers will provide some feedback for you on, and of course I will provide you some feedback as well.